Welcome to the Read Your Keys podcast. I am your host, Joel Lopez. I just wanted to start off and say go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. It's on iTunes, Spotify, and you can also check us out on BuzzFeed. Today, I have the privilege of having Mr. Jack Peach. He is a man who is helping men develop meaningful relationships. He is the author of Weaponized Sex, Feminism's Assault on Women, and you can find him on his website, thinkinpeach.com, and you can find him on Twitter at thinkinpeach. Jack, welcome today to the Read Your Keys podcast. How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Thanks for having me on, Joe. It's great to be here.
Hey, so and from what I've found of you, Jack, I was initially just kind of caught by the threads that you would have. Like you would have these threads on Twitter, and it was just like you had this insight onto, I don't know if human dynamics is the right word, but just male female relationships, and just the insight into culture is really a big thing. So welcome to the show, Jack. Can you just go ahead and give us just kind of a brief tidbit about yourself so we can kind of introduce you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jack Peach, as Joel introduced. You can find me in all those places there, mainly on Twitter and my blog. And yeah, I think the things about culture is sort of based in my background, because actually, surprisingly for what I talk about in our scene, I'm actually a trained sociologist. So like sociology is normally quite a left-leaning subject. Mm-hmm. It's populated by feminists and other things. And that's actually kind of what informed a lot of my opinions growing up, because actually, sociology, there's a lot of good stuff in there, actually. There's a lot of interesting stuff that gets kind of put aside due to the definite ideological bent, which is within the subject. Because, I mean, they would say there are three founding areas of Marxism, feminism, and functionalism. Actually, functionalism is more of a sort of right-leaning thing. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, but I was definitely sort of growing up with the enemy, if you know what I mean, at university, dealing with that. And that actually informed a lot of my insights because of that, but also because I've got the training, right, in how to analyze culture. So that's why I talk more about culture and gender dynamics. Really, it's a result of my background.
Yeah, I didn't know that you were a sociologist. That's pretty interesting. Let me ask, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in England. I'm from a city called Leicester in England. It's quite a small place in the East Midlands of the country. It's still a city. It's one of the bigger ones in England, but it's still not a big city.
And so, what I found interesting from you is I saw your podcast that you had with Chance Lunsford and the Logo Centrifugal podcast. You could find Jack on that podcast as well. It was that you said you had grown up as an atheist, and me growing up in America as a Christian, I even at times felt like a fish out of water. And so to me, I'm very curious, like how somebody who grows up an atheist, like there's no religious training just to make it easy to notice that something isn't quite fitting right in the culture, because it's just like, if that's where you grow up, that's just how you, like, I grew up somewhere, this is just the way it is, so you kind of accept it. But for you not having that background, that's very interesting to me. So how did that come about?
So I was raised both my parents are atheists, and in England, basically England's a secular country now. I think America, you've still got a lot more of a religious heart to you still. It's not like Christianity has not been completely expunged from your country, whereas in England it very much has been. Like there's very few Christians around, and if they are Christian, they keep it quiet. Mm-hmm. Because there is an intense kind of feeling that there is definitely a persecution, I think, actually, of Christians in Britain. If you say you're Christian, you're basically looked as a bit of an idiot,
Hmm.
like some kind of like remnant from like the Bronze Age or something. You've not grown up and like adapted and like evolved or whatever
Hmm.
into what is the modern form, which is a secular like scientific position. And there's a lot of sort of construction of Christians as like this is what Christians are, like rather than actually talking about what they are. So you grow up kind of with an impression of Christians in your brain, which doesn't actually match reality. Actually, now that I've actually, I mean, I'm Christian now, but now that I've actually met Christians and spent time with Christians, which I never did growing up,
Hmm.
because they just either didn't exist or kept it so quiet you didn't know because there was a intense pressure put upon them. And I think that when I first came in contact with Christians, that provided a bit of a like a wake up moment, sort of like, oh, they're like asking them about why they're doing certain things, and then they're giving me an answer, and I'm like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense actually.
Uh-huh.
Like, and then that kind of woke me up, and then over time I sort of softened my position. But I think I think in general, like part of Christianity or part of is generally like a story of persecution, right? As well. I think that's, I mean, from Jesus's time onwards, that's kind of, I think no matter where you live, you're always going to suffer some amount of it just because of the teachings are set against what is easy. You know, it's not easy. You have to fight against it. And there's always going to be a pressure from others on people who act differently, whatever it may be. So I don't think you'll ever completely get away with that, get apart from that. But
Well, I think the being in the West, I think that's what make. I mean, I can't speak for England, but I grew up in California, which is very liberal
mm,
now, or very left leaning, or very secular, however you want to phrase that. But I do remember, um, I went to public school, and I remember in early elementary school that we would sing Christian songs in school.
mm,
I very much remember that. We would sing, what is it? He's got the whole world in his hands. We would have our Friday musical day, and we would sing these songs, and it was not a big deal. Christmas, what we all celebrated Christmas. It was still called Christmas break at the time, but there has been, since I've been in school, or left school too, that there has been a just kind of a strong lurch away from that. And so I grew up going to this school, which probably was, would be considered like a low income school. And I moved to like a richer suburban area. And I remember I was speaking to another student in class, and I was talking about the Bible or Jesus with one of my classmates. And I remember the teacher was like, "You don't talk about religion in school, separation of church and state." I'd never heard that before.
mm.
And that was like my first, like, oh, I'm not supposed to talk about this. I've never heard this before, because it was just before, when I was in the low income area. It was never it was never a it was never an issue. And so that was my first kind of, oh, this is not okay. But it sounds like, from your experience, it was already like, this is not something that we speak
Oh
about.
yeah,
And plus, you didn't grow up in it, so there would be no reason for you to. It'd be like talking about the tooth fairy or something, I guess. To
yeah. I mean,
nowadays.
that's pretty much how it's viewed in Britain. Definitely, it's seen as, yeah, like a fairy tale or something, that you why are you believing in this kind of madness, right? And but you mentioned that, like saying like you this like sang hymns and stuff at primary school. Actually, we did the same at primary school. We would still, yeah, sing hymns in the mornings at the assembly and stuff. But it was, everyone would like be like, including the teachers, would say like, why do we do this? If you know what I mean.
Oh,
So there
okay.
was like, it was still just about there, but it was on its last legs. I doubt they still do that. I don't know for sure.
Uh,
I haven't been to a primary school in a long
it's
time,
been a while.
but
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But it was already the prevailing sentiment was, what is this? And we used to like make up like silly lyrics, kind of things that now I like not even dream or dare of doing. I think it's incredibly playing with fire, actually. But that was kind of how what we used to do. Is we change the lyrics and still sing them. It sounds the same, but the lyrics are different. It was very, very taboo, actually. Religion, very, very taboo. I knew one guy. I think we wanted to get into this, and I think it's a good segue. So I knew a guy. I wrote about him in the book. I didn't use his real name, but I'm going to call him John, who was a Christian, a proper Christian. And he got bullied like a lot at school for his faith and his belief. And he never talked about his belief. He never talked about his faith, but people knew he was Christian, and that was enough.
How did they know he was Christian? He had a cross or something, or
I can't remember, honestly. I think how word gets out at school, and people just knew. I'm not sure exactly. There were a few people went to. This was in middle school, and a few people went to like a Church of England primary school. He was one of them, but not all those people were Christian, right? But when they joined, obviously some of them knew or whatever. And he was a bit of a dork, to be honest. So he did kind of. I mean, in my heart, I think he'd have probably got bullied anyway, just the nature of schooling.
Yeah.
But that kind of made him like a super easy target, and he suffered a lot because of that. Like when I look back on it now, like I was never a bully, but I was friends with him, but never like good friends with him. But when I look back on it now, it's pretty tough. Like he had to go through that as a kid, like in that school, and then you kind of extrapolate that one circumstance out. People would like attack him, call him names, like I went to a pretty rough school as well. Like attack him, like for it in the playground and stuff. And you can't help but think that that's going to have some kind of effect on his mentality, his view of faith, his view of his religion, his view of himself. That I mean, obviously contained within the text is contained within the Bible is how to deal with these kind of issues. But as a kid, you're still not equipped to deal with that. The scripture can say one thing, but you're a kid, you're not ready to deal with that. Like what
kinds of things we're talking about? Just like getting in fights and like getting surrounded by kids and
surrounded by kids, punched, like kicked in the private areas and like often, and that was pretty standard fare as kind of a joking sort of boyish behavior, honestly. But he definitely copped the worst of it, and a lot of name calling and not including in groups and ostracizing him, and he'd have to be sat on his own and in class and stuff at times. And if you extrapolate that out, that's just one example, right, of my school that I know of probably one of the few people who was openly Christian and white, by the way. A lot of like black and Asian people had their religions, and it wasn't persecuted in the same way, which is part of a wider agenda, I think, which maybe we can get into later. But if you extrapolate that out throughout England, or every school, for every person, you can see why there's a growing trend of secularization, because you're placed within an environment from 4 years old that is basically militantly atheist, and that's going to have an effect.
Right.
You're there 8 hours a day. It's a long time.
So. Is that pretty standard there in England then? Is you because here it's you're 5 years old. That's when you go off to kindergarten.
Yeah, over there, like 4 or 5. Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like that you kind of start in preschool there. Do you guys have a preschool that's kind of standard for you guys?
We have preschool, but it's not necessary to go. So it depends on the parents and their work.
Okay.
Normally. But yeah, you can get people who take their kids to daycare from 1 year old, 6 months.
Yeah. We have that here too.
Yeah, but that depends on the parents. That's not by 4. I think at 4, or it might be 5. I can't remember exactly. I think it might depend on like when you're born, like your date of birth.
The cutoff time.
Yeah, the cutoff. So it might be 5 for some others. That you will be at school at that point. And I think at that point it's only like half a day or something. And then when you're like 6, 7, it becomes full day, and that's mandatory unless you homeschool.
So
That's mandatory.
before we kind of dive deep into the book, can you kind of give us some background on you and kind of what led up to you going, growing up being an atheist to now being a Christian and having these ideas and revelations for the book? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, sure. So it's a long process that led to that point, but basically, without having like some grounding, which is what I think religion really provides you with,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of started slipping off of it, like down a slope that was pretty negative for quite a while. Because the drinking culture in Britain is very, very. I mean, if you don't drink as a man, you're not seen as a man, basically, and that starts pretty early. And the culture in general in Britain is pretty poisonous, pretty toxic in some ways in modern Britain. I don't think that's a traditional thing in Britain. I think that's a new thing that's kind of developed over the past sort of 30, 40 years. But and I started going down a pretty slippery slope. And you mentioned earlier that growing up as not religion, it must be hard to see like what the problems with our society are. But actually, I think growing up, I kind of felt like something wasn't right, but I just didn't know what was, if you know what I mean. I couldn't put my finger on it. But I knew for a long time that I felt there was something off with Britain, in our culture, not the country. Or like modern Britain. I love my country, but it's got some really bad expressions in modern form. Its modern form, and I knew something was wrong. And I was drinking a lot. I was partying a lot, and like I just knew that actually I had to change something in my life at that time. And once I finished university, obviously that's kind of standard university fare, but once I finished university, I knew I had to leave, basically.
Are you 21, 22 years old at this time?
22, yeah. I mean, I'd already decided before I finished my master's that I had to go. I had to finish it because, like, I'm not
you were 22
I'm
and
not quit.
You were 22 and you finished your master's already?
It only takes a year in Britain. So,
okay.
Yeah, that's the British system. It's pretty intense, but it only takes a year instead. I think most countries in the world it's like 2 years.
Yeah.
And your degree is 4 years. In Britain, our degree is 3 years, and then the master's is 1 year.
Gotcha.
You can do it over 2 years if you want to, but yeah. Anyway, I decided I needed to, because I went to university in the same place I grew up, so I didn't leave. So I was still with my same friendship group that I grew up with from.
Let me ask. In studying sociology, were you beginning to kind of diagnose now what was going on around you? Were you using some of those tools, or not yet?
Yes, definitely. But I think I was using the wrong tools or looking at it with the wrong perspective, actually, in that time. I knew there was something wrong, but I used to be very much a Marxist, actually. And I was growing up in that system and educated in that system and sort of used that lens to view the world. And I thought that was where a lot of the problems come from. And I do think actually there is a certain amount of truth to that, which is what makes it a very compelling argument, because there are some problems with, for example, how work is structured. I do think there's problems with how work is structured, but that doesn't mean that it's like capitalism's fault and it's the oppression. No, it's just how our system is set up. It could be optimized better. But when the faith part of it came, I went traveling to Asia, which is obviously where I live now, because I knew I had to get out of my environment. That was my main goal, was just to get away from, not get away from my friends, but get out of the drinking, partying crowd that I was with. And I felt like if I stayed in my hometown, I couldn't do that. So I decided just to leave, and I had some money that I'd saved up, and I decided just to go. Basically, I booked a flight to Thailand, flew out here and I had funds for about 6 months, and traveled around and saw some new cultures, did some new things. I was on my own the whole time, which has its own challenges, but also its own rewards as a result. It grew me up a lot. I think I learned more in probably the first 2 months of traveling than I did in 3 years of 4 years of university,
Really,
honestly, because
like what?
it was pretty intense.
Like what? Because that's interesting. Because I didn't have the typical college experience, and I've never traveled on my own. Like wouldn't even really go to the movie theaters by myself because I have brothers and sisters, so I've always been around people. So I'd be, you know, that's just the way I think I'm built. Like I just wouldn't do that. But
I think it's better, actually. I think it's a natural way.
what's
Yeah.
that?
I think it's better. Like I grew up as an only child, so I didn't have brothers or sisters growing
Uh-huh.
up. So I think having like being part of a close knit family is actually better. You don't need the development that I did, I think. So carry on.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no. That's an interesting point because that is part of the culture in England now, right? It's one kid or two kids because I'm one of three. So and then being Hispanic, Latino, Hispanic, whatever you want to call it, like I have lots of cousins. Like I would go to family events and be introduced to somebody new and be like, this is your cousin. So you hug and you kiss and you go and play again and like have no idea. Um, but in England, growing up by yourself, I could see that, that's just a whole nother that builds you up in a way where you are traveling by yourself because you're maybe more used to it. And so I'd like to understand, like, you go through a very rigorous education because, being here in the States, like I think of England, like you guys are, very logical, very rational. You guys have a long history, of a high education. So whether you're studying the right things that are going to help you or not, it's still very rigorous in
Yeah.
my from not understanding, but that's just my outside
Yeah.
looking in. So you go through this rigorous studies, and even then, you're on your own for 2 months in a foreign country, and you learned some things. Like, what were some of those things that you realized or kind of epiphanies that you had?
Well, the first thing is you're completely removed from all support networks. And
Mm-hmm.
not only are you completely removed from your support networks, you're completely removed from your own culture. You have no
Mm-hmm.
tie to that area. You don't know anyone. You're completely on your own. Like, because as I said, I didn't travel with friends. I was literally just on my own. I think being an only child, I've always my parents were always very, like go and play with other kids, like because you need that.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never actually had a problem kind of just speaking with people I don't know, because from a young age my parents were very much like, yeah, you need to go do that. So that wasn't a problem for me, but it was the fact that after, like, the people you meet, you don't have really any connection with except for the fact that you're both traveling. You're
Mm-hmm.
both like in Asia, and they're very transient relationships. It's based on we're both traveling to the same area, so we might spend a week together, and then okay, we're going on our separate ways. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a lot of like very intense relationships where you get to know someone pretty well over like a very short period of time, and then they're gone. But then you're never really with someone, if you know what I mean. You're always coming back on your own,
Mm-hmm.
on yourself. And I did it the budget way, so I was traveling like in hostels. I was sharing rooms with people, which provides its own challenges and lack of sleep. And obviously, when you're out traveling, you're not eating the healthiest diet either,
Mm-hmm.
which when I look back on it now probably didn't help. And different foods and everything. And it was great in some ways, but it's hard, very hard in some ways. People kind of don't realize like traveling alone is tough. Actually, it's
Mm-hmm.
for an extended period. It's fine if you just do it for a week, but
Mm-hmm.
doing it for 6 months is it's quite a long time frame. And that it just forced me to grow up in a lot of ways, actually, because I stayed at home at university, and I'm sure university has a similar effect on people when they first go and they're kind of forced to be in an environment where they don't know anyone and have no support network. And actually, in the book, I talk about this and how I think that's actually very dangerous for women,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, and why I think that is. But for men, I think that's okay. It's fine because we have to stand on our own 2 feet. That's kind of part of being a man, is being able to step up to the plate. So
Well, there's different vulnerabilities for a man and a woman, and you address that. Like my wife was telling me, there was a story here where a nurse is leaving from her night shift, and she's walking down a street, and there was a man behind her, and he was like, "Hey, it's dark. This woman's alone. I'm a
Mm,
man. I'm going to cross the street because I don't want her to feel threatened by me."
mm,
And so he crosses the street and goes down the street so he can't see her anymore. And then as soon as he leaves, she is like attacked.
yeah.
And my wife said, she's like, I never would have thought about that a
Mm,
man would try to remove himself from a woman's presence so she doesn't feel threatened. And I was like, yeah, I do that all the time. Like if I'm like, I'll go for walks really early in the morning, and we're here in the summers, but it's dark, and if I see a woman, I'll cross the street just so she knows, like, hey, I'm, it's one, I'm like I'm 6'2". I'm not like a giant, but I'm 6'2", and at night, or it's dark. This is something that I do just so they know, like, hey, but hands up, like I'm not a threat to you, and I want you to kind of see that I'm not trying to be threatening, so you can, keep your guard up and go, and that's fine. In the book, I don't want to speak for you, but can you kind of let you segue into like, the challenges that a woman faces going into a university environment on her own?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a big problem with like a wider problem with society and not kind of embracing the realities of biology, right? And that is that women are vulnerable to men. They are. Like that doesn't mean all men are rapists, but to deny that women are vulnerable to men is patently ludicrous. You just have to, and we all, you just have to look at the way of history, right? You can look at anything you want that obviously paints that picture. And one of the problems with removing this kind of uh, this differentiation between men and women, which feminism and wider secular culture, and I like just as an aside, like when we're talking about like atheism earlier in schools and feminism now, they're actually kind of like they're different prongs of the same ideology. In my opinion, they're like different avenues of this, that have the same or similar goals. Uh, and I think when we forget that women are vulnerable to men, and we want them to be like independent, want them to be able to, be able to live life freely without any limitations placed upon them, you're kind of forgetting like that there are biological limitations, and there are things that like limitations and like rules are often put in place to protect people. They're
Mm-hmm.
not put in place to oppress people. And I think that's a key like semantic difference or a key like difference in viewing what these rules do and what removing them has done is remove the protection that women need and put them into a more vulnerable position as a result of that. And university does that in a load of different like subtle ways that I think people don't really consider. That when you remove a woman from her family, you actually remove her from her safety net. I talked about this for me when I went traveling. It's the same thing. You're removed from your support network, and there's kind of a safety net, both an emotional one, but also for women, it actually is a very much a physical one, especially like still it is for younger men, but once men become sort of 18, they have their own physical presence, and a man's less likely to challenge that because they're going to get the potential of violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a man can overpower a woman, just generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
That's just patently true. And when you remove women from the environment where they're surrounded by their family and place them in like shared dormitories with many other like men and other women and young men, and you remove them from both the emotional support, so if they're having problems, they no longer have their family that they can go and talk to, their father, their mother, their sisters, their brothers. They cannot go and talk to them, but also they are just more vulnerable in that environment. They're in shared halls, and they're also in a culture which promotes sexual freedom as
Mm-hmm.
a rite of passage. It's considered, if you go to university, you're going as much for the experience as the education nowadays. And that in itself is a very potent ideological tool, I think, for shaping women today and shaping men as well in a different way. But And it plays out two different ways. Like women are more likely to be sexually assaulted at university than anywhere else in the world,
Mm-hmm.
in society. And part of that is like because it's filled with 18 to 24-year-olds and they are more likely to be sexually assaulted than anyone else. That is true. But they are still more likely within university than in other positions. And part of that is because of the culture at universities and the way that it's set up. And yeah, there's drinking culture. Drinking is also associated with sexual assault.
Right.
There's no support networks. They are trying to find themselves with people they don't know. They're trying to conform to that culture, fit in exactly with new people because they don't have any connection to these people beyond just meeting them. They are in not when you're in halls of residence, then not particularly well protected in those environments, and you're sharing a room with people you don't know. I mean, or you're sharing a house or an apartment or a complex or whatever you call with people you don't know, and not all people are fully formed good people.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and that goes at any age group.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a few different ways this happens, both in making them more vulnerable for assault, but also for conditioning women to accept sexual, like casual sex, or seeing themselves as a sexual object, actually. And that's the most important feature of them. And I think feminism plays into this in a few different ways as well.
So if we're looking at the university environment, because I think that plays a huge culture sometimes, or a huge factor in determining behavior. You have a climate of heavy drinking, and then you've removed the people who would protect a young woman. This need for acceptance and wanting to conform and fit in, and then I don't know about you, but at 18 I was anchored in my faith and I had goals, but I still didn't really know who I was at that time. So I can't imagine for a young lady, going into college and kind of being thrown to the wolves. Like, I think that when you're going to get your driver's license, you go through and you get tests and stuff like that. But with dating, there's not a lot of direction and sex when you're really playing with fire. Yeah. Like for me, it was very much, I wasn't. We would go to church, and I had a desire to want to go to church and learn. I'm by no means, and like I can't go and quote scripture for you. I very much just had the stories in my head, and I decided that they were true, and that was good enough for me. It's like these things are true because I see it around me. Like my grandfather is kind of the father of the faith in my family, so he passed it on to my dad, and my dad didn't drink. I never saw my dad touch a drop of alcohol, and my parents loved each other, and I could tell that, and my parents prayed for me. So I very much took these things on, and it's like this is the way to be. So when I did get older, these were things that you could say restrained me in a good way, because I didn't give in to urges and try to go up, because that was just something that didn't really interest me. But even then, like, I went out to college and it was still like, hey, you still want to fit in even though you have these things. So I can't imagine for a woman who is much more vulnerable, who is now disconnected from her family and maybe doesn't have that basis or that anchor to kind of help her get through in this new challenging environment with no bearings. That seems like, that sounds like a recipe for a lot of bad decisions to be made.
Especially as women are more likely to conform than men, just biologically as well, by the nature of their being. Like, women are more likely to want to conform. You can see this from, like, at schools. You go to a school, most the girls are far more easy to control than boys. Boys are more likely to go their own way. They're more likely to stand and stick to their guns than women, in my
Mm-hmm.
experience. And when you and university as well is completely aimed at women. If you look at the proportions of people that go there, it's predominantly women. The majority is women. It's, I think, about 56% of all university
That's what I was going to ask you. I thought it was
students,
like it's increased quite a bit, where it's not
and
even
it's
even
increased.
anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's grows every year, that proportion. So for me, I think that's part of an ideological goal. Actually, if you want to shape a society, if you change its women are the people who pass on culture,
Mm-hmm.
more so than men. Men to their children, men defend culture and they form it, but women are the ones that pass it on because they're the ones who primarily socialize their children in their early years. And also, I mean, again, talking about society in general is very difficult because it's very multivariate and everything affects everything
Mm-hmm.
else. So, like when I'm talking about these things in general, you've got to be very careful. Like for the people listening at home, like I'm not saying that this is what exactly 100% why. There's always 10 other
Mm-hmm.
factors
You're
which
right.
play into it, and everything sort of coalesces together. But that's actually what makes me believe that this is purposeful. It's because if you look at modern culture with this lens, you see that everything is pointed in the same direction. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
everything seems to have the same goal: the removal of faith, the promotion of feminism, the
Mm-hmm.
promotion of Marxism, the cultural institutions, whether it be music or film, all seem to point in the same
Mm-hmm.
direction. And that's what leads me to think this is a purposeful change.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that women are the ones. What is it? Women are the ones that replace culture,
Reproduce.
reproduce. Because
Yeah.
I read that in the book. Again, the book is weaponized. What is it? Weaponized
Weaponized
sex.
sex. Yeah.
So I read that in your book, and I thought of my wife right away because I work a 9 to 5, and before all of this, I was outside of the house 10 hours a day, and my
Yeah.
kids were in school 8 hours, plus the hour getting ready. But now that
Yeah.
I'm home, I work from home, and we're homeschooling our kids now, and my wife is here, and my wife is teaching our kids, and I can hear her explaining things to my kids, and I'm very much in my head saying, "Thank God for my wife." And my kids
Yeah.
went to a good school that I think they're called charter schools here in Arizona.
Yeah.
So they're not public schools, but they're not private schools either. But they very much
Yeah,
focused
we have.
on the virtues and the trivium, which is seeking truth, goodness, and beauty, which was something that very much attracted to me. So they promoted these things, but I still wanted my kids to have a sense of mom and dad very, very, very much. And so I hear my wife explaining things to my kids, and I'm just like, thank God that she's the mother of my children. Like a lot, I'll have that thought in my head because I can hear it now. Whereas before, if I was at work, I wouldn't know, and it would have been different, right? Because the kids would have been at school. So I don't know who they're associating with, and we picked that school hoping that there would be other parents who felt the same way, and I felt like they did for the most part. Like it's like they're not going to agree with you 100% on everything, right? That's kind of foolish
Yeah.
to want that. But here at home, it's like when my wife says something to my kids, I'm like, yeah, that's my girl, and she's teaching our boys and our girls this stuff that I'm glad that this is the way that it's turned out. And just side note, didn't you just get married or?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Several months ago. Yeah.
All right.
In July. Yeah.
Okay.
Only a few months ago. Yeah.
All
I
right.
mean, we actually got. I'll tell a little bit of backstory. I haven't really talked about this because I try to keep my relationship off
Okay,
the
we don't
internet.
have to talk about that. That's cool,
Yeah,
man.
but,
Okay, that
but
if you don't want to
but
go
we
there,
got.
that's fine.
It's all right. This is okay. Like
Okay.
because we got affected by the whole coronavirus thing because we were supposed to be married in March.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, in April. We were supposed to be married in April, and both of us, where we live, neither of us are native residents of this country. So we were planning to get married in my wife's country, and my family was supposed to be coming, and we got that all obviously got completely cut by by coronavirus because all the borders here in Asia shut, and we couldn't travel to where our wedding's supposed to be. So so I mean, we still can't. So we waited for 3-4 months, and then after 3 or 4 months, we were like, okay, we can't just keep putting this off. So we got married here. God provided us with a great ceremony, and it all worked out for the best. It's a shame none of our family can come, but that's life, So, but yeah, I mean that whole thing of homeschooling as well is like that's kind of seen as this like odd, weird kind of thing today. But if you actually look at the whole of human history, that's how people were educated. The state schooling system is the experiment.
Exactly. This is the anomaly. That that's how it's been done, and I'm thankful that we had the opportunity, because we had kicked around the idea of doing it, but there was kind of no reason to rock the boat, and there was this intimidation factor. But once we kind of got thrown into it, it was like, oh, we think we can do it, and there's still a learning curve that goes along with it, and there's good days and bad days, because it's having to put on a teacher hat, and here we're going to have a lesson, but you're still mommy and daddy, so I'm going to act up not in the same manner that I would in school. But it's all good. Like, we're able to teach them other things that I feel I missed out, like in my schooling time, that I would have liked to learn. And that's kind of where we say, hey, these are the things that we missed out on. Let's kind of provide these things for our kids, because that's kind of what the goal is, right? Like, you see that what you didn't have, you try to provide that for your kids so they can go farther than you did. So going back to the book, I think one of the big things that was really interesting to me, and I think we've touched on this a little bit, but this is kind of a part that for me that's I think is kind of where it all starts, is the demise of faith. So you have a chapter on the demise of faith. Can you kind of, I guess, go into that a little deeper from your perspective and what you've seen?
Yeah, of course. So obviously, being informed by this is my own growing up without faith, and my own witnessing a faithless country, which is England. And also, before I lived where I live now, I lived in a country which is very religious. You cannot not be religious. It's not Christian, it's a Muslim country, but you cannot not be religious. And that was actually the real start of my awakening to religion. Before that, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't ever think religion was the solution. That didn't enter my lexicon. But when I lived there, and I just saw that people are happy, and like this religious country, we're always told like that's like barbarous, and like everyone's like it's oppressing everyone, and everyone's miserable because of religion. That's what we were told growing up. Like in the education system we're just talking about, it's how all these areas intertwine. And when you're being taught these things at school as a kid growing up, you never really question them, because even if you do, the teachers are all atheists. So. And for me, if I go home and then ask my parents are atheists, so there was never any pushback on that. And when I went to live there, and I saw like they were very, very religious country, and everyone is very, very happy. I couldn't I actually use the word contentment. I've got a thread about this. It's going to come out probably tonight or tomorrow about the difference between happiness and contentment. But people there were just generally a baseline of contentment that we don't have in England, definitely growing up. I think people in England generally are pretty depressed. And that kind of woke me up to the fact that there's something really wrong here. And then once I started exploring this idea and viewing things through that lens in my own life, and I became, so my wife is Christian, and she was Christian when I met her, and that's been a big influence on me. Seeing her and her family and how they operate and witnessing it, and it's a very human way of living. I kind of think this is like every time I see them do something that's religious, it's great, it's good, it makes sense, it feels good. it like is very human. It's expressive. We're talking about like what's going on in our lives. So when you're praying as a group, you're emptying your heart to someone, and there's God in between that. But in a sort of psychological sense, you're sharing yourself, and therefore it's a kind of almost therapy. You're sharing your problems, your desires in front of an audience, whether it be private with God or whether it be in a group setting when you're praying together. And then you open about these things, and you've released that tension inside of you, and then they know what your problem is, and they can talk to you about it as well. And then, if you want to look at it in a rationalist sense, that's very like psychologically makes sense, and then they can then help you with your problems, whatever they are. And obviously, if you look at it in a religious sense, then it's God working through them, right? It depends. Right. If you look at it with both lenses, it both ways make sense. And that kind of really got me thinking about it. And then I started analyzing things in a different way, more on a macro perspective for religion. So initially I saw like on the micro, on the individual level, I saw religion being a good thing for people individually, from my wife and her family, and through witnessing them. And this was obviously before we were married, and how they behaved. But then I also saw it at the macro level because of the country and how people behaved in that country. And then I started like putting the two together. And I started doing some research and reading about the matter. And I realized that religion is a more human way of behaving. It has an understanding of human biology that I don't think science has. I think this is based in, again, you can always look at these two ways. You can look at it both the rationalist way and the religious way. The religious way, God created us. Obviously, he understands us. So he gives us what's best for us. The rationalist way is that this is a time-tested institution that has lasted so long that it's very unlikely to be wrong. Most of it's probably right. Otherwise, it wouldn't have lasted so long. And it wouldn't have founded empires and kept societies. And every society is religious apart from modern society, by the way. Like whether it's Christian or Muslim or like Greek or Roman, they have their Greek and Roman gods. Every single society is religious, ever, in the whole of history, except for today. There's a reason for that, just in a human level, on a rationalist level, there's got to be a reason for that. And then I started looking into it, and I realized that without religion, humans lack something. They lack meaning to their life. They lack depth to their life. They lack understanding, and they lack a grounding that keeps them focused when they are being hit by propaganda. Let's just call it what it is. When you're looking at the media, when you're looking at the education system, you've got a lot of propaganda in there. And if you don't have that grounding faith, you can be blown whichever ways, basically. And you're going to move with the culture much more than you are if you have faith, or you have something that will always bring you back. And you realize when something bad happens, or they tell you something bad, you understand why it's bad. Okay. And then if you extrapolate this out from one person to every other person who's faith, it makes people more manipulable, more like they're more easy to be molded into ideal citizens, or whatever that may be for the powers that be. And it also means that they're pushed away from what is good for them, because religion is good for you. Having religion is good for you. It makes you feel more balanced. It makes you more understanding of what you need to do, how you need to behave, and gives you the reasons why you need to do this as well, which is very important.
What do you say that the common argument that's I've heard is I don't need God to be a good person. In your experience, because even then, you grew up atheist in a culture that has moved secular, but there was still that Christianity was still very much deep in English culture, right?
Yeah, it is. So for me, I think the way that I kind of think about that is it's an argument in humility. I think that you need to I can be a good person just by myself. I mean, it may well be true. I mean, I don't think I was actually a bad person growing up, and I don't think my parents are bad people because they don't believe in God. Right? They are still good people, and they did a good job raising me. They made mistakes that maybe could have been avoided if they'd been Christian. but it's an aspect of humility versus arrogance. If you believe that you are capable of doing everything and you can do everything fine and you don't need any help, I mean, it may well be true, but it's actually an arrogant and egotistical position that I don't think is actually good for you. Whereas if you're religious, it puts you into a state of humility where you understand that this isn't you, this is something else working through you. And that mindset change actually makes a big difference to how you view life, how you treat other people, and how you behave. And I get the argument that you can be a good person, not be Christian, or not be religious or whatever. Yeah, of course you can. I don't think anyone really argues that, but I think you can be a better person if you're Christian.
Because I think from my perspective, it's like, okay, just say you did grow up atheist and you'd never heard the name of Jesus or God or the Ten Commandments, but you still grow up and you know what the golden rule is. Like, you still very much, these stories are kind of all around you and have provided, well, here in America anyway, this cocoon for you that has allowed you that freedom. And so, yeah, you know, you're right. Yeah, I know lots of people who are atheists who I love deeply. They're great people. But I guess it's just kind of like that. Hey, we're all, you know, once we come from the religious lens, you know that, hey, we're all sinners, and you have to humble yourself. Where was that humbling aspect for you? Did you feel like you were full of pride up until that point, or? Yeah, I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah, for sure. I still probably am, to be honest. I was very obnoxious growing up. I was an obnoxious kid. So that's something that has really benefited me in my personal relationships as well, actually, that humbling of myself through religion. Now I think I'm a bit more amicable than I was in the past based on my arrogance. And I think as well, like, it's worth saying, like, I'm a new believer. I'm definitely not like well versed in the scripture. Like, I'm someone who I would consider myself in my behaviors and my habits being a pretty good Christian, but I'm still very much in the infancy of my journey, which is why I don't really talk about it on Twitter or anything, because I don't feel like I'm in a position to teach other people on that matter. So while I'm happy to talk about it, I'm definitely not an expert on that.
Well, you know, because what really attracted a lot of things did to just the things that you would say on Twitter, which is, you know, the confines of the medium, but in listening to you speak with Chance, that you had brought up the idea, or you made the observation, that you have media, you have the arts and culture, and you have academia, and I'm like, this guy gets it. Like, he gets that there are, it's not just one siloed area where it's like, hey, if you go to watch the news or something, that it's just happening there. It's like, no, it's being reinforced in education. You're being influenced when you turn on the radio. And so when I'm reading your book too, you're going through these things, and I'm like, wow, like, you see all these things. So was that your sociology hat kind of putting those together?
Definitely. Growing up or at university, talking about, like, I talked about this with Chance, like, cultural hegemony of Gramsci is very much like core reading as a sociologist. And even though he was a Marxist, his ideas still hold weight. He was obviously a very intelligent man, his ideas were correct, 100% correct in my opinion. So that's applying that lens, but applying it actually that to using a different foundation to view it from. And what I talk, the book is called Weaponized Sex, basically, because I believe that sex has been weaponized against primarily women, but also men, obviously both, just because the focus of my book was, like, I think women have been hurt more actually by it. That's why.
Very good.
Cool. So yeah, I think women have been hurt more by culture, and that was just kind of the focus of the book rather than like because you got to be careful, like not to get too lost in these things, because I think sex has been weaponized against us, but I actually think culture has been weaponized against us, and that would be a bigger topic. And I talked about it obviously in the book, but I could write probably another book about that. I just not at this time. It was a lot of work, a lot of effort. Maybe in some point in the future, I can iron my arguments out a bit more. But
what was that? What was that author's name that you said? The Graham what?
Gramsci.
Is
Gramsci.
Is he the guy that said the long march through the institutions?
Yes.
That was him. Okay.
Him,
yeah. Okay. I just wanted to, I've never heard the name, but I've heard that phrase. So what you're saying here kind of put that together for me, but I wasn't sure if that was the same person. The long march.
That's like
okay.
That's like the quote people know, and the theory is of cultural hegemony. It's basically there's a theory of power which is projected by culture, and culture can shape that power, and that's actually where the core element of power, especially in the modern age with mass media, etc., comes from.
So there's I don't know if you would call him a preacher. His name is Lance Wallnau. This is where I heard this first. So he talks about when Jesus is tested, the devil takes him up, and he says like here are all the kingdoms. It's called the seven mountains, and so basically it's the political mountain, the educational mountain, the family mountain, the arts, which would be like sports, arts, things like that. The business mountain, government, and there's one more. I think it's media. I don't know if I said that or not. And so basically the premise of what he says is the devil offers Jesus the kingdom. He's like, hey, you can have all these. And, Jesus, he doesn't need them because they're his anyway. But the premise of what this is saying is that the person at the top of the mountain, depending on if we'll say they're a godly person or not, determines the mountain, what direction it's going. Because we'll say academia, for instance, the Ivy Leagues started as a way to train the clergy, and so that's what they were initially started off for. Like this is what it was, very, very rigorous. But as soon as they seeded the universities, the Ivy Leagues first, you had this vacuum, and it is now filled by people who are non-believers. And so these were the things that when I'm reading you, it's like, man, like this is like you kind of see these things, but it's just you're using a different language, and you also use a lot of studies and research that you did and you cited in your book to kind of use a much more which is just speaking the language of academia. And then you had mentioned that you have these academic institutions who are now coming out with studies and are peer reviewed by people who have the same ideology to let it more credibility. And then that is now a foundation now, a closed loop where now it's like, okay, now we can take this out. And so when I was really excited reading your book because then you got into another thing where you go back into the 60s with the sexual revolution, and you talked about Janis Joplin, and that's kind of before my time. It wasn't really my cup of tea, but you went through and you read the lyrics, or not read the lyrics, but you had the lyrics written down of some of her songs, and you're just like, wow, this, like, I'm reading this, like, this is heartbreaking to read this, but this, like, coming from now into 2020, those lyrics are tame. Like, those would be the most tame, but that was very much just the foot in the door to where we are now. So how did you see those? How did you see those things?
I actually did at university a whole whole module on the 1960s, because the 1960s within sociology are considered as one of the seminal time in our history in culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I was drawing a bit on that with my own perspective. Of course, they presented it as a positive in university, because it freed women, it liberated women, and all this. And even as a Marxist growing up, or like I was very left wing, I was never actually bought into the feminist side of it. My dad is a very working class man, and he was like a trade unionist in Leicester, and like a Marxist, and very much like, and my granddad also, I come from a strong like Labour background in Britain, and Labour would be like the Democrats in America, but a bit different, just because of obviously the history and everything. Like Labour never supported the KKK, but they've come from, that's the background I grew up in, right? And but my dad never bought into the feminism side of it, because he could feel that, if you know what I mean, as a working class man, he could feel like when feminism was attacking men, it was attacking him. What he didn't realize is like the other aspects are also very negative, which he didn't quite tap into because of his own experiences, which is obviously fine. But so I already had that like feminism is bad growing up, even though I was very left wing. I still like, there's biology here, man. Like men and women are different. It's just common sense. Like you can't. My lived experience and what I witness is telling me something different to like the feminism side of it. Like that could never get into my brain, whereas the other aspects did, just because of reality. Which is why I think today that male feminists are probably some of the most deluded people in our society. And I actually think all these things actually are actually a form of psychosis, actually, where people have become switched off from reality and become deluded, and it's been formed through the media, like this position. And also I actually think like when you take kids out of the family, that causes a kind of mild trauma in them, which also means that they can be more easily manipulated. And I have a few sort of more out there theories personally.
Well, like you feel it and you see it every time the kids get dropped off for kindergarten. The moms are crying, the kids are crying. It's we're kind of told like, hey, this is a good thing, but there's very much, as a parent, you're dropping off your kids to somebody I don't know, and it's you have to really decide to kind of do that. Like, this is what we do. You tell yourself that. So yeah, I think
that's the power of culture. Is it? That's why culture is the most important like thing to control, and it is quite obviously controlled. We know who controls it. You can just follow the funding, who owns these things, and then follow it up into the groups that they also fund, their foundations and stuff. You can see there's a few groups who seem to control all these areas. So that's what leads me, like, they always say follow the money, right? That's a truism. Follow the money, and if you follow the money up of these institutions, it's quite clear that it's purposeful.
It's funny because I used to hear that phrase, quite a bit, maybe 15 years ago, and now it's not something that it's really talked about so much anymore.
They've stitched up the institutions more in that time, so you can't say it anymore because it reflects back on them. In the past, we didn't have as many monopolies as we do now. And I was going to touch on something else before, but I've lost it now. So
where's the counterculture? Because I think that was something that kind of
yes. That was it. Sorry. Yeah, I go off on tangents quite a lot.
That's okay.
So, the counterculture was basically the first time that it was just. So there's a few different ways. Again, like you can always go further back. That's the thing. Like with society, as I was saying earlier, everything influences everything else. And the counterculture was the generation after the Second World War, the First and Second World War, which removed a lot of people. Like obviously, a lot of people died and killed off a whole generation of men, basically. And then after that, there was there wasn't the men to guard culture in the same way as there was previously. And I only decided to go for the 1960s because I thought it just suited the book more really than bringing in the 1940s as well. And it left a whole generation of children without fathers, or the people who would be guarding culture, the patriarchs of culture, were not there anymore, or reduced at least. Obviously, they still existed, but they were reduced. And this meant that there was an ability to push cultural narratives, which I think would have been pushed back on more. And this is when the trends had already started, but this is when secularization and obviously feminism and things really took off and accelerated. And part of this was technological. And I talk about this in the book. Like, technology creates revolutions, soft revolutions, because when you have a new technological advance, it can completely change the way humans act. And one of these technological advances was the invention of contraception. The contraceptive pill meant that you couldn't have feminism as you do today without the pill. And if you actually look at the story of the pill, it's quite an interesting story. It was originally looked at to try and cure infertility, which is a good thing. It was trying to make infertile women fertile again. But then they realized it was mimicking the effects of pregnancy and preventing people getting pregnant. And that's when Margaret Sanger, who's a very famous feminist and eugenicist, took control of it and started funding it, and then started remarketing it and rebranding it as something that is positive. And you will often notice as well, like, marketing and rebranding is very much part of these movements. That's where the culture comes in as well, is it's creating this construction in your mind, creating this new reality, and creating what I define as a psychosis. It's a separation from reality, a slight delusion, which I don't blame people for, as I say, because the culture, it's hard to fight against that. And things go on when we're kids that we don't like, removing them from their parents. It causes a mild psychosis, which makes them more manipulable. And all these changes in the 1960s came at the same time. You had relaxing of the divorce laws, you had the contraceptive pill, you had music and drugs flooded the market in the 60s. We still had drugs before that, but then we had these new types of drugs, and then if you look at the way that the 1960s was presented, is it was given, again, this marketing gloss of flower power, of peace and love. And right there is actually like the 1984 sort of newspeak that we witness so much today. But that was kind of where you see that really come into play. It's like flower power.
This degenerate behavior.
Yes.
But we're going to cover it in
peace and
flower
love,
power. Yeah. Free love, and make it sound nice when it's just really very destructive.
Yeah. And, drugs, like, if you look, like, in that era, there was a huge amount of violence at the civil rights and civil unrest that took place there. But they're peace and love, but they're actually, and you see that today with Antifa. It's the same thing. They're anti-fascists. It's a rebranding that means that you've got this picture of something which is completely divorced from the reality. And it's exactly the same then, by the way. It's the same process. It's nothing changed there. Just what they're protesting about is slightly different based on the cultural climate they're in. And you look at the drug abuse, the sexual abuse that took place in those 1960s areas. I didn't get into any of the cults or anything, but all those cults in the 1960s, those like liver commune style places, it was always just a psychopathic, manipulative man creating a cult personality around himself to sexually abuse women. And that was the core of all of it, as far as I'm concerned. And when you paint it in this picture, it creates an image in people's minds. And those trends have now, back then they were counterculture, right? Now they're the culture. And that's kind of what my book breaks down.
I wanted to ask you, because I remember reading that you had brought up Haight Ashbury, the Beatles, the Rolling Stone, and Janis Joplin. I think it was in the chapter. I don't know what chapter it was in, but I think it was all around that. But what was it that you found in those things that were would just say there was negative consequences to giving them a platform to spread the message. Because you also brought up the Easy Rider movie, and I tried to pull up the YouTube link, but it didn't pull up for me. So just I think that was all together in a certain page, and I remember thinking, I was like, well, what were the things here that you saw in these? Because I wasn't I might sound weird, but I didn't really care for the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. So it's like I don't really have a frame of reference as to like what did you see? Because I'm from like the hip hop era, so I could very much.
I mean, the same processes in that actually. But for example, if you just look at some of the lyrics, I mean, okay, the Rolling Stones have a song called "Sympathy for the Devil," right? I mean, that tells you just the name alone tells you about that. And if you look at these, the people surrounding these individuals and what they were doing, they're all degenerate drug takers that were like. I have other theories on LSD and psychedelics, which I don't know, maybe we could go into. Or that kind of a lot of my thoughts in the book are actually informed by deeper thoughts, but I wanted to keep things kind of focused, right, to what I was writing about. And for all these, okay, so the musicians are kind of like idols, right? We put them, and we can see that today as well. They put on pedestals to present them as like a public image of what this behavior means. So the Beatles are all very attractive young men. I mean, okay, but they're fawned after by the women, and they're presented in that way, and then they're presented with their music, and their music is cool, and therefore how you get women is like be like these people, right? And what are they doing? They're taking drugs. They're engaging in orgies. They're doing degenerate behavior, and you kind of create this image in people's mind that this is what's right, this is what's good, this is what's cool. And all of those cultural institutions basically have that goal. And like, for example, the clip I pulled from Easy Rider, I might have to re-edit the book. Thank you for telling me that. I didn't realize the link was broken.
Well, I don't know if it was just the way I was reading it was in the read. I didn't download it. I was just reading it. So I don't know if it let me click on it for that reason. So I don't know. So I'm not saying that the link didn't work. I'm just saying that I couldn't click on it just in the way I was reading it.
No worries. But in that clip, there's like basically the Easy Riders, the bikers come into, and there's other stuff in that movie, but I thought this one was very interesting, so I wanted to talk about it. And they came into like a southern bar, right? And there's like the old patriarchal sort of normal, like kind of sexist, racist kind of men in the South, white men in that area, like traditional, what you'd consider like stereotypically. And they're sat there. And they're like, who are these guys? Like, what they do? And look at them, like long hair women, kind of, they look like women, like, you know. And they come in, and they present like the Southern men as like very obviously racist and like not good people. And then they have the way they present the hippies is therefore that they are like better than these people, right? Because they're not acting in this way. So it's kind of racist. Yeah, because they're not racist. So there's like a contrast there, which makes you view them in a positive light. Because racism's bad. Right. Like it's not good, obviously. But when you present it in this way, it therefore creates this kind of hierarchy in your mind of their behaviors, or one is worse than the other. And then the way that the hippies behave is they're actually very, they sexualize these Southern belles that are in there. And they're talking about them in very sexual ways. And what that does is it creates this image in your mind that if you want to be like better than this, you can behave like this, you know. And then they go outside, and then they're on their bikes, and all the girls are like, "Ooh, look at your bike!" Like, and it creates this this image of how to get women and what you should be doing to get women. And instead of it being like, you should be like a characterful, responsible man who cares about his woman and wants to take care of her and wants to marry her so that he can create a family with her, which is the purpose of all relationships, which should be the purpose of all relationships. Instead of viewing that, it's viewing them as something that's like to titillate you, to make you like just attract the women, and it's like seem cool, and you can just sleep with them, and then it doesn't matter, you can move on to the next one. And that was the point I was trying to make in that film, is because it's talking about sex and how sex has been weaponized. Um,
Well,
and
that's yeah, that's interesting because they did frame it against racism, which is wrong.
yeah, of course.
They didn't do it in a vacuum where it was just a nice normal guy who was not racist. They had to frame it against someone who was racist, and so in relative to the racist, this behavior is acceptable. And I think you did go into how before there was very strict what is it,
The motion production, the
yeah,
motion
motion picture
picture
MPAA or
bureau.
MP
Yeah,
something like, where it was like, hey,
yeah.
these are the things that we don't speak about. So if they're going to put a foothold in the culture to allow this to say that this is okay, they had to frame it in a way that would make it acceptable, which makes sense, because I might have seen that movie. I don't even remember it, because I just remember it was like, hey, this is a great movie. So like I watched it and I was like, I don't see the big deal about what this movie is, but in context at the time, you have to see if this is very much, it'd be like, rap music in the 90s with the, explicit lyrics. It was, now you'd be like, well, this album is just like any other album, but it's like, no, well, back then this was a big deal. The Beatles were a big deal. They were
Oh, yeah.
huge sex symbols. But we don't see it now because like Paul McCartney, really, that guy's a dude that's getting chicks. Like, oh, okay. Was John Lennon this dude? Oh, okay. Like, so yeah. I think it's great that you were able to kind of put that into context of what it meant at the
And
time.
I wanted to show as well that these propagandic techniques are very subtle. When people think of propaganda, they think of like 1940s propaganda, which is so crowbarred, it's very obvious. But
Mm-hmm.
the techniques have developed way past that. And this was in the 60s, like it's even better now. Like, and I'm trying to show it's like through subtlety like this is actually how you're manipulated. It's not like very obvious ways. It's this small contrast, which unless you're analyzing it with that brain, you're not even going to notice.
Have you heard the frog in the boiling pot analogy?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that to me is just like, I heard that in church a long time ago, 30 years ago, and it always stuck with me, like, oh yeah, but there has been just a tremendous slide in the culture and what's acceptable in the last 10 years. A slide has been like, wow, this is a steep, this is a steep, like, we have the Netflix Cuties movie. It's like, this was something that would have been unimaginable even 5 years ago.
yeah.
And now here we are. It's like, hey, let's put this out. It's like, no, I'm not okay with this. But I think it just kind of all falls in line with a lot of the points that you make. It's like, it starts off in academia, in psychology with the DSW, and changing, what are they called? What are they called? Not diseases. What are they called? The diagnostic manual. Anyway, so it's just like, yeah, this is what psychologists use to diagnose things, and things were changed in there, because I think they're working on pedophilia now. Is a thing that they're working on changing that. So it's just like, okay, like, no, if there's a hill to die on, like that's the hill to die on. So what are you seeing now in modern culture? Because you have a chapter on modern culture, and you did kind of speak about your experiences in clubs and the music that you were hearing, and how that was basically training, or what's the phrase that you were saying? It's just conditioning.
Yeah, people.
Yeah.
I think there's like, for the Cuties was a great example. Like, if I'd have still been writing the book, it'd have made the book.
Yeah.
So I think in general, like there's a very obvious concerted push, and as you said, it's accelerating. It got to a point now where there's like my generation is so well conditioned that they can push a lot faster than they could in the past, because my generation has completely grown up in this environment the whole of their life. So it's different because someone who's grown up half their life with it, half without it, they still have a contextual reference to what things used to be like. So they can really accelerate now. And I think as well, I think this would have probably happened anyway, but I think with Trump being in office and having more of a conservative pushback in Western countries at the moment, it's kind of forced an acceleration of it, because I personally believe that Trump is the first politician we have who isn't owned by this establishment in America for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
That's important, because the world follows America. Like, just as an example of this, when America closed its borders to China, that's when the country I live in closed its borders the next week.
Mm-hmm.
There was no talk of that before. And then America did it, and they're like, okay, we're going to do it. You know, like it's America is who is followed, right, in the world. Certainly in this sphere of influence, anyway. So I think that's kind of forced a bit of an acceleration that may, like, I'm not sure if there's definitely a push to normalize pedophilia in academic circles. It's been around for a while, seeing pedophilia as like a sexual orientation as opposed to.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that was being talked about when I was at university. I remember being like, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
But and there's been other pushes around that area, and normally there's like a set pattern it follows. Academia tends to be first, and then they sort of sound out the waters. What they give it the veneer of acceptability, or the veneer of respectability that academia has, and then they'll move into journalistically from that. Then after journalism, like in certain like op-eds and stuff, they'll tend to move into like wider culture. And they're at that point now with pedophilia is being moved into.
Yeah, because I know there was a woman who did a TED talk on it within the last 4 or 5 years. Because in my mind, usually things like this start in academia because it's very open, right? So it's like the open inquiry. This is the place where that happens, and then it seems like for me,
doesn't get into public consciousness at the time as well.
It's not there in public consciousness, but then I think it does make its way into like movies, is where I would seem to pick up on where it would hit my radar, right? Because it was like I had seen the TED talk, not that I'd seen it, but I had heard about the TED talk, because I'm a dad now, so I'm very, very, very much now want to be aware of like what is going on in the world so I can prepare my children. That's a big thing. So when I see stuff like that, I'm like, no, that's not something that I'm okay with. And then so as a parent, okay, this is something I need to prepare my children for. And then the other thing is, what are my kids watching? And so I need to be very, very aware of that. Which is funny because this is kind of a side note. I was watching, not Apple TV, Disney Plus, and I used to watch DuckTales when I was a kid, and if they had DuckTales, I was like, oh, cool, this is great. Like, I'm gonna watch DuckTales, and now I have my kids, so this is gonna be great. Like, I'm gonna watch DuckTales, and the very first episode, the very first scene, there was a witch in a pentagram casting spells, and I was like, what? Like, this is Disney. Like, this should be something that is acceptable. But it's like, it was a pentagram. There was no mistaking it. Like, this is a pentagram. And it was just like, all right, we're not watching this. But like, as a kid, like, my parents weren't watching what I was watching, and I don't know what else, other kind of messages.
Yeah.
From there, that's pretty bold, I think. Like, they wouldn't have put a cross and like, lights and angels, but they put a pentagram there. I was like, wow, this is okay. We're not going to watch this. But so just things like that, I'd want to be very aware.
And now even that filter's been removed with like phones and stuff. Like when you give a kid a phone, especially as a teenager, you got no control over what they're doing with that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is another way of like technology kind of bypasses like social, like societal and parental control, and lets things be. That's
Yeah,
the culture.
you bring up a good point, because I just kind of wanted to circle back to the technology piece, because we had touched on the pill and how that's now created a new place where now sex could be strictly for pleasure
Yeah.
without the quote unquote risk of getting pregnant. So now you have that. I didn't grow up with the dating apps, where now it just seems like that's a now you've poured rocket fuel. So because like for me, like that, I didn't grow up with that. Like we were still, like, internet dating wasn't even a thing yet when I got married. So
Mm.
or it was, but it was still in its infancy when that happened. So I can't imagine. Did you grow up during that time when
Yeah,
these apps were available? So
yeah,
did that just create just like a, I don't know, some kind of a monster? Because I to me, like, I don't. My friends are older, so we didn't grow up in that. Like, all the things I've heard are always kind of like, dang, like this is what my kids are saying are on there. I'm like, dang, that's what your kids are talking about. Like, that seems pretty crazy to me.
mm. Yeah. I think it definitely. There's a culture now around sex and around dating, which is definitely not healthy, and they've played into that, but they're not the only part of that. And they again, it's just an acceleration of other trends that kind of started with like MSN Messenger when I was a kid. Like MSN Messenger was like how people used to talk like after school, right? And you could do video cam on that, and you could like you could obviously talk to whoever just in chat form, and that it was kind of like, now that taken to its end is OnlyFans, right? Now it's been monetized for like women to be able to like sexualize themselves and pimp themselves out from their own bedrooms. You've got teenage girls that can do that, and their parents don't even know, you know. But that started with MSN Messenger, and that was my generation. And while I never like, I was a prude growing up, I was definitely way too scared to like do anything like that as a 13-year-old or whatever. But my friends, on the other hand, like, yeah, you all knew stories about people having like video sex, like on their cameras using MSN Messenger when we were like 13, 14. That was very common. And again, parents have no knowledge of that. They just think their kid's on the laptop. You know, they didn't realize that that was what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, even though you might have a view of keeping your daughter away from a man outside of school, for example, you don't realize that that's going on in their room when there's no
Mm-hmm.
man there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, now you've got OnlyFans, which is like unbelievable. Like, this is suddenly surged onto the public consciousness, but it's just a continuation of trends that's kind of obvious for anyone who kind of is noticing like the pattern of the world. As you say, the slowly boiling the frog metaphor is the metaphor that's taken, because you could not have done that from the 60s after the pill. You couldn't have gone to like OnlyFans, right? People would know that. But over time, you gradually loosen the morals, you loosen the values, you loosen the understanding of sex and the dangers of sex, the dangers of promiscuity, the dangers of casual sex. And suddenly this is fine, actually. This is perfectly acceptable for young, like, teenage girls to do it. And again, this kind of loops back into pedophilia as well. And if we want to tie it back in, there's also the importance of faith, because faith is that grounding force which cannot be manipulated by these factors. You cannot manipulate someone of faith in the same way you can manipulate someone who doesn't have faith, which is why there's been a concerted attack on religion for so long. Because the only people, not the only people, but the majority of people who are resistant to these changes are religious, because they have a grounding and a knowledge that this is wrong. So when we went right at the beginning, we were talking about like, why do you think that like faith is so important, or the faith's demise is so important to this? That's why, because it provides people with a touchstone which gives context to what they're doing outside of culture, the culture we're in. And yeah, as the quote from Romans, like, you don't conform to the culture that you're in. paraphrasing,
Yeah.
paraphrasing
Yeah,
there, but
you'd be in the world, but not of the world.
not of the world, right? So that's why religion is so important. That's why religion's demise is so dangerous. And when I go back to like where I used to live and see this, like when I went there, like pornography is illegal in that country. You can't get pornography. Like you go. I was there and I was still in my old way of thinking, right? When at this point, this was years ago, before I was religious, before anything, and like growing up of my generation, watching porn was completely normal. And I was like, oh man, type in like the porn website, and then it's like you can't get on it, and I was like, huh?
Mm-hmm.
And this was another sort of moment that woke me up to it, and it's like there are countries in the world which still don't work like this. In that country, you can't get contraception unless you're married, and you have to take your marriage certificate to get
Mm-hmm.
contraception. So it's not like this is just like we've got to remember sometimes, and they've been more westernized, right? I'd say they're like a generation or two behind the West in terms of their values. Like my wife's generation is kind of like my parents' generation, or like my, and then her parents are like my grandparents' generation, you know, or maybe great grandparents. And the process is still working there. But we have to remember there are countries where this still goes on, and from my experience of living there, they're a lot more happy, a lot more content than people in Western countries who are living in this culture. And that was originally what woke me up to how bad, like, or to this aspect of, like, as I mentioned, I always thought there was something wrong with the West, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. But now I've lived in that culture that put my finger on it. It was the death of religion and the values that are taught in a religious society, which is led to by degrees of separate, like both on a personal level, but also on degrees of separation.
Do you know what year Nietzsche said that God is dead and we killed him?
Yeah.
Was that before the 60s?
Yes. Yeah. Nietzsche was 1880s or something.
Oh, he's way old. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why I asked. I was like, I don't know, but well, like for me, from what I've observed in church in America, there was very much the church became closed off and wanted to stick to itself. And so for a Christian or a person of faith in the church to be involved in politics was like, this is an activity that we don't need to concern ourselves with. So we're going to leave that to the people who are like unclean. That's kind of a message. Or like another thing would be in business. It's like, put it this way. If you were a new convert here in America, in most churches, the high calling is to be in the church.
Yeah.
Like that's where the calling is. But really, in my opinion, from what I've seen, and this is my opinion, like I'm no theologian, so but this is just kind of what I've seen. The thing is that you need people of faith to go out into the world, because that's what affects the culture. People in government who are God-fearing people who are artists, who are God-fearing people. Like that's why I think that Kanye West and what he's done is groundbreaking. A big criticism for a lot of Christians is just that the music and stuff was bad. It's not cool. But here you have a guy like Kanye who is like the definition of cool, and he's shunned it all really and turned his back on all the sex and all the drugs and all the money for Jesus. And he puts this album out, and this is an album that I can listen to in the car with my kids. And that's big. I don't know if you've heard the album or not, but like my kids sing these songs, and it's like I'm okay with my kids singing a Kanye song. Like that's a big deal, because it goes back to that, you know, conditioning. Like my kids are young. Like I don't want my kids to be robots. I want them to be able to think for themselves. But while they're young, I want to train them in my faith and my values, so they can go out and, you know, decide for themselves, and hopefully that they make the decision to go choose God. Like when I pray for my kids, I always pray that they would love God with all their heart, mind, and soul. Like that's my prayer for my kids. Like that is the prayer. Like I might get it wrong. I tell my kids all the time, Daddy's not perfect. When I make a mistake, I own up to it as best as I can. But I'm always pointing them like, hey, like Daddy is making his best effort to get to God and be in alignment with God, and hopefully you make the same decision too, because I think you had mentioned like the goal is to meet your grandkids, and I was like, yeah, that's the goal. Like, and I probably came to this maybe like 2 years ago, and my kids are a little, they're not babies anymore, but it was very much like, oh man, like I want to meet my great grandchildren. And I was like, dude, how did you come to that? Because you don't have kids yet, so it's like, but you're able to see these things, and that's why I was like, so excited to speak to you.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a wider, like, I was making that argument actually kind of because there's a school of thought that like kind of like what we call like biological determinists, which I agree with to an extent, but they have some of the wrong ideas in my opinion. So like biological determinists kind of believe that everything is based on like human biology, and like biology is all that matters. Whereas, and then you get the opposite, which is like the social constructionists who like everything is culture and culture is all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth, as with all things, is somewhere between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Culture and biology interplay. And one of the things that biological determinists always say is that like reproductive success is simply just having kids. That's it. Once you've had the kid, you've succeeded. And I kind of wanted to push back on that because from a biological standpoint, yeah, you might have kids, but if none of your kids reproduce, then your biological line still dies off, right? So until you see your grandchildren, you cannot confirm that you successfully reproduced, basically. And it was kind of a pushback on that. And then that leads into why culture is important, because if you don't socialize your children properly, they will not have children or won't have grandchildren. And that's like how the two kind of interact on a biological frame, because you can't separate the two. And that's what I try to do with the book. I try and tell you biology is very important, but so is culture. Like it's not either or, and you've got to see how biology informs culture and how culture informs biology. Because also there's epigenetics, which shows like your DNA literally changes based on what you do. So, and then you pass that DNA on to your children as well. So that's also like your cultural environment, which is why you get like dysgenic families, which is like a family where everyone's fat because the parents are fat and they actually pass genetics down to their kids. It doesn't mean they have fat genetics. It means their behavior makes them fat, and then that changes their genetics, which they then pass down to their children. It makes their children easier to get fat. That's why you get like fat families. It's not just the fact they eat badly, although it is. If you
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
I mean, it is actually because they eat badly, because they, if they didn't, they wouldn't switch on those biological markers. But there is actually a biological determinant as well. Yeah. So this is like how these things are not entirely separate, right? And that's kind of what I try and hammer home through the book. If that comes through, I'm not sure, but nothing is simple when it comes to humans. But there are certain things that if you fix, like the second order effects, actually, because it's the second order, the devil's in the detail. The second order effects are often the worse problems than the original first order effects. And if you fix the first order thing, if you have that correct, the second order effects kind of disappear. And some of these first order problems are like viewing sex as for pleasure. That's a first order effect that like then has, like the idea is that it liberates women and it means we all have good sex lives, right? That's the idea. But then the second order effect is it causes mental health problems. It destroys society. It makes culture harder to reproduce. It means people are lonely. Like so many problems come from that first order problem. And we have to fix those first order problems.
Yeah. You know what, something that kind of came to me when you were speaking, because you were saying that men are the defenders of culture. And so in the Bible, it says, if you're going to take the house, the first thing you need to do is tie up the strong man. And the devil, when he comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So that is the goal. The devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I believe that.
Yeah, me too.
And so you say that when women have casual sex, that is to their detriment. But I also think that for men, it is also because now a man who's having lots of sex is not one who's going to stand up for principles. And if we're talking about a man who has lots of sex, maybe we're talking about a man of prowess. And I think you had mentioned um, in the book about like athletically gifted men who are to that effect, powerful men who are able to have access to that. So they do pay a price in that they give up the high ground that they could have had for the pleasure. And so the quote unquote strong man is tied up, and now you add in the drugs and whatever else. I don't know if you read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, but there
Yeah.
was this sex was very prevalent, and there was soma, and it was just like everybody's in a stupor. And I can kind of see that now with the advent of these apps where sex seems like it's very prevalent. Porn, like when I was growing up, you had to make an effort to get to porn. Like you had to find someone's older brother. You had to go to a video store, go behind the curtain, which was like they're not letting kids behind that curtain. Like you had to make an effort. Whereas now it's like it comes and it finds you. So I can't imagine, you know, kids now, but then my kids like, okay, like this is something to be aware of. It's like you have all these all these facets of a culture working against you doing the thing that you should, in my opinion, you should do, which is save yourself for marriage and have a family. Like you have all these things. But for me, it's like as a Christian, it's like, well, my goal is that I can pass on my values to my kids, and hopefully, when speaking to people like you, is that we can promote these values because I think they're good values. Like I want good neighbors. I have kids. I want good women for my boys. I want good men for my girls. I have both. I want that very much, and that starts with, me first, because you did mention that it's like, hey, you have these very strong guys who womanize, but then when it comes to their mom or their sister, now it's like, hey, that's not acceptable. I was like, come on, dude, like you gave up the high ground with your behavior.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people kind of, because obviously in our area of Twitter there is a lot of guys who think like that, like just like pickup artist styles or like male degenerates, and they've got some things right, but they've got a lot of things wrong. They don't have values basically, and one of the things that one of the things I try and say to push back on them, like as an argument, is like this is why you can't find a good woman. And this is why you live in this culture which you don't like, which hurts men, is because of acts like that, actually. Like, this is how it hurts men as well. We have to live in this culture. We're the ones who, like, if these men trying to find wives, but the reason they can't find a good wife is because of behavior like that, like promiscuous sex. It takes two to tango, it's not
Mm-hmm.
just women. It's
Mm-hmm.
definitely men as well. Um, um, uh, they have to understand that, like, some of the, for me, it's just completely incongruent look where you can't complain about not being able to find a good woman, whilst also simultaneously promoting promiscuous sex,
Mm-hmm.
because one leads to the other.
Mm-hmm.
So I always I think it's a good thought for them to, because what, going back to like the metaphor of slowly boiling a frog, you kind of got to do that with changing people's minds as well. You can't turn someone from like a liberal to a conservative, like with one argument. It's a slow process, and you have to have different people on different stages of that process. And that's one thing I'm also conscious of, the way I try and present things, is I try and
Mm-hmm.
present things more from like I kind of write for how I myself would have been like 5-6 years ago, something that would speak to me then, like
Mm-hmm.
as an atheist, as someone who's like in that culture and of the world, like how you can lead them on that journey to bring them to religious freedom, or like to religion, which I think is the ultimate end goal for people. I think that's what people should be aiming for, is to be a religious person. And even though I'm a Christian and therefore want people to be Christian because I believe that's the right doctrine, I also am perfectly fine with you being another religion. I think if we just had a religious society, it would be a better and healthier society.
Well,
So
because there'd be a point of agreement, right? It's like, hey, this is we don't have to worship the same God, but if we have the same values, then
yeah,
we can live in a society peaceably and
yeah,
go about our lives. Because I think that's right. That I don't like I don't need you to agree with my doctrine. I don't need my neighbor to agree with my doctrine. I just need my neighbor to be neighborly, to
yes,
not work against me. Like I want to be able to, hey, if I need some help, that you would be willing to extend the hand, and vice versa. Just so we can live together. Ultimately, I would like people to have my faith because I think it's right. Just like people who have their faith think it's right, but they're entitled to their beliefs, and I don't have a
yeah.
problem with that. But don't try to hurt me, and I'm definitely not trying to hurt you. So we can have that as a baseline. Like let's work with that.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very very important. Like I think I don't think we'll ever get back to like. Okay, let's link this to a wider point. Ali, you were talking about like the church in America has kind of given up on like political institutions and business institutions, and I agree with you. I think that's wrong. I think like we are, as to use the quote we used even a minute ago, we are in this world. We're not of this world, but we are in this world, and we also have a responsibility there to bring God's heaven onto earth,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the only
Mm-hmm.
way you can do that is if you're in positions of power.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you've surrendered or we've surrendered these positions of power is the exact reason why we are like why Christianity or religion in the West is dying. That's
Mm-hmm.
why, because people are in the positions of power are not religious and are either atheist or perhaps even further to that,
Mm-hmm.
and is in like I would consider like Satanists.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to, and I think that's something that has to be done. It has to be fought back and retake these positions of power. And that's why also I think it's a very good thing that Trump is in the White House, because I believe that he is not perfect, but he's obviously a religious man and he's obviously got the right values as far as I'm concerned. He
Mm-hmm.
can't necessarily enact everything just because of, again, boiling the frog. If he did that, it'd be political suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I do think as well that we are going to have a bit of a pushback now. I think more and more people are waking up to the realities of this culture. I think we're kind of at a tipping point at the moment. And I hope, anyway, I pray that there's going to be a bit more of a rebalancing in the coming years. And I think it's hard sometimes to tell because we're in a bit of a bubble on Twitter. You get into your echo chambers,
Yeah.
but I do think that more and more people are starting to wake up to the realities of the culture we live in. I do think there is a bit of a pushback, but I hope so. Anyway.
Yeah, the spring break culture can only last for so long before all of the was it the chickens come home to roost, and just you would you hate for the people to pay the price. And I think when we talk about um, pickup artists and things like that, me being me, like I want to definitely tell people what I think, but there is a part of me that's like, well, how does God see these people? Well, he sees them with love, and so I was like, hey, I need to soften my heart because they didn't have the opportunities that I had to grow up in the family that I had, to grow up in the situation that I had, which I think was ideal. I'm grateful to my parents and my grandparents for putting me in this position. Like we were not wealthy by any means, but I feel like I grew up in a loving home and we did our best to honor God. And that's an inheritance that I'm grateful for. And you did bring up the verse, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And like I grew up in the church, and that was never a verse that I hung on to, but there is very much like that is actually our responsibility, is to bring heaven on earth. Like that should be my actions, like where I step. Like I am an ambassador, and I probably forget that a lot, but that is when I have interactions with people, that's the way that I should be behaving, because I am a representative of the kingdom, so I should act like a representative of the kingdom, and I don't always do that, but that should be the goal, to make this world a better place, right? Because you have we'll say a university campus there, that's if you're taking out God. I read somewhere that that's the definition of hell, is a place without God. That's what actually hell is. It's God is not present there. So as a Christian, if my place is the university, to step foot on that university, and now I'm bringing the kingdom on, and I have the authority of the kingdom because I'm an ambassador, to now this is where God's truth stands. It stands with me, and that's kind of the part of the Bible, is that now God, the Holy Spirit, is in me, and I take that with me, and I have that in my interactions. And so it's not up to me to make a convincing argument. It's just me just to do what God says, and that's that.
Yeah. I think, I think as well, like, it's worth remembering that love is not always, love can sometimes be hard. Yeah. Sometimes you've got to punish people out of love. So, I think one of the things that the church has got too soft in that regard as well, like in my opinion, because, as long as it comes from a good place and you know that what you're doing is to improve someone, you can be hard with them. You can be hard on them. But you've got to punish children sometimes, like, I'm sure you know that as a parent, you can't just always like allow them to do what they want. You've got to realize that, okay, sometimes you do something and you need to be punished, but it comes out of a place of love. And as long as you do that, you can still be a good Christian, in my opinion. And I think that's one of the problems that the church has got. It's got too soft with regard to that. And that has allowed it to be overtaken and exploited and all the rest of it. So,
yeah, there's definitely the church has to stand for what it stands for, and
yes.
there is the like I
of the world,
right there, like, because I didn't really experience that in the churches I attended, like my church for a long time. It's like, hey, this is what the Bible says. You cannot like it, but this is what it says. And so I've been fortunate to attend good churches that way, but I have like gone to go visit places out of state, and I'm like, wow, this is what you guys are talking about. Like, this is just a social club. So like, okay, good luck. And I think now there is definitely a restructuring now. There was a lot of churches that closed here, where now that the churches that were strong are going to come out stronger. And I think that's, in the short term, it might be painful, but I think that the church overall will be better for it. I think sharing your ideas in this way is a step in the right direction. So that's why I appreciated you being able to come on and share with me and speak to me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for giving me the invite. It's always good to be able to have these chances to share your mind in a different way. Like, Twitter's a great medium, but it lacks a lot of the nuance. Sometimes I get like tired of how I have to tweet to get the engagement. So it's nice to be able to actually share with nuance and give the depth behind it. So.
Well, that's kind of why I wanted to start the podcast. I had the idea. Like, I've always been very, what's the word? Not intimidated, but self-conscious about my writing, and Twitter's all writing. So it's like, okay, that's not my strongest suit, but I really like talking to people, and it's just like, I read your threads, and it's like, man, this is a guy I'd really like to speak to. So thanks a lot, man, for coming on. Hope that this gives you the platform to be able to speak to some new people. So I think we're gonna go ahead and close up shop here. Any last plugs that you have here? I'll go ahead and shout out your web address and things like that again for you, but you can go. You're more than welcome to plug it too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the best place to find me if you enjoy what I'm saying is on Twitter and on my blog. Twitter is more for just interesting engagement and get you thinking about some things and try and write it in an effective way. And the blog's where you can really unpack my ideas. But as well, obviously, if you enjoyed what you heard, I'd really recommend picking up my book, Weaponized Sex. There's a link both on my blog, there's a tab on my blog, and also in my bio on Twitter. It's on Gumroad. If you just search Weaponized Sex, I'm sure it'll come up. I'm very proud of it, and everyone who's read it has really enjoyed it. I haven't had a single negative comment yet, so it's I'd love for you to be able to read that and hopefully influence the way you think and see the world. And I think it will provide, there's a lot of depth in that. I think I go on some tangents as well off the message, so I think everyone can take something from it. So yeah, I'd love for you to be able to do that. I also, just as an aside, I also offer like consultation or mentorship programs if you fancy having like a chance to speak with me and help sort out some issues that you want to go over or some thoughts you want to go over. And if that is something you're interested in, please just DM me and we can talk about it. That's not a problem for the people at home.
Doing it for the people. All right, Jack. So this is Jack Peach. Again, he helps men develop meaningful relationships. He is the author of Weaponized Sex. I'll put his links on the show notes. You can find him on his website, Think in Peach, THINKINPEACH.com, and also on Twitter at Think in Peach. The book is the Weaponized Sex, Feminism's Assault on Women. If you're following me, you probably feel the same thing, but I think if not, it's just a great way to challenge your beliefs. Thank you so much, Jack, for coming in. You woke up early in the morning for this. I appreciate you, brother. Take care.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.